Well, we had a fun weekend. Yesterday we took some time to drive up to Golden as a family and to watch a swim meet. The University of Wyoming competed against Colorado School of Mines, and when Amber saw that online, we said, we have to go watch because I'm a big Wyoming fan, and if you know me, you know I'm a big swimming fan as well, and so we went and had fun doing that. But also, something else we did this weekend, on Friday night, we had dinner with some of my cousins. People that we've recently just reconnected with. They aren't really my cousins, they're my cousins' daughters, because I was so young on my dad's side of the family that some of my cousins' kids are closer to age than me than my cousins are. But we reconnected with these girls and just recently, and have had a few meals with them, and we were able to have them and their husbands over for dinner on Friday night, and just had a wonderful time of fellowship together and a meal and just laughter. We got to tell them the story about Amber, and it surprised me that they hadn't heard Amber's story. And if you don't know Amber's story, I'll give you the very short version. We were told 8 years before she was born that we would never have children. And Amber kind of surprised us and proved that wrong, but she was a special blessing from God, and I was surprised they hadn't heard that story, and we like to tell that story, so we'll tell it whenever we get the chance. So we took a little time to tell them about Amber's birth. It seems like here at Village we have a lot of couples who have struggled with infertility issues. In fact, I went through my mind and I came up with 6 couples that I know of that have struggled with that at various times in the past, and even some that have been here in the past and wouldn't be here today. I guess it shouldn't surprise us, because the latest statistics I could find say 19% of couples in the U.S. struggle with infertility. So it's not a small number of people. You know, in the Bible times, infertility was a shame for women, not just because of the personal sadness or personal regret, but also because of cultural humiliation. One Jewish tradition said married childless children were as good as dead. Now that's harsh, isn't it? That's harsh. But you know what? God doesn't view it that way at all. God doesn't view it that way at all. In fact, God has a special place for the downtrodden. God has a special place for those who are forgotten and lowly people in the world. And that includes infertile couples. That includes anything else you could put in there. There are numerous examples of infertile couples in the Bible and the special role that God has for them. And one of those is Hannah. And we want to look at this woman named Hannah today. We're going to begin a study in a book called 1 Samuel in the Old Testament. And 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings are one long story. And I've always loved these books, reading through them. I've always thought it would be fun to preach through these historical books, but I've kind of avoided it because this is a huge commitment, because to preach through this is going to take a very long time. So I thought, well, we'll start with the first part of it, and I scheduled it all the way through into this summer. And so this is where we're going to begin, and we'll be in this book for some time, called 1 Samuel. It's an exciting book. If you saw the video that Brittany posted, what we said in that video is that a gal named Joyce Baldwin, who has since passed away, an Old Testament scholar, I have a few commentaries of hers that I really like her perspective on things. And she says, this book presents life in all its ambiguities and in all of its psychological complexities. And I said in that video, there are no spelled out theological truths in this book of 1 and 2 Samuel. And we're kind of a church that likes theology. So where are we going with this? Well, it's theology in real life. I mean, it teaches theology through real lives. And that's where it gets practical and meets the road anyway. And so I'm looking forward to this series, and I hope you are too. But it begins with a very brief look at 3 different people. 3 different people, and the middle of these 3 is the heroine of our story for today, and she really overshadows the other 2, and that's this woman named Hannah, whose prayer we've looked at already a couple of times today. So I want you to turn to the book of 1 Samuel in your devices or Bibles. And the parts I'm reading are not on the screen today. I'm going to be actually scanning through a lot of material. And this is going to be the case in this whole series because we're covering a very big book. And we're looking at major portions rather than very minute pieces. And so a lot of times the passage will not be up there. You just want to follow along in your own Bibles as we work through this story. And so again, there are three people in the beginning of this story that are important. There's a man named Elkanah, there's a woman named Hannah, and there's a baby boy named Samuel. And they outline our story for the day. So the first we want to look at is what it says, a certain man named Elkanah. That's an interesting description. That same description is used of a couple of people in the book of Judges. Particularly of Samson's father, which was interesting because Samson's father and his wife were in the same position as this couple. And also a very similar phrase are used of other people. And this tells us this is just a continuation of the story that we read in the Old Testament book of Judges. This story is just going on from there. And after it names Elkanah, it gives 4 generations of his lineage. And because it does that, you have to assume that this man has some significance in the nation of Israel. We don't know how much, but at least some, because they recognize who he is and his family. Now, it doesn't tell us this here, but we find his genealogy also in the books of Chronicles. And there we learn that he is of the tribe of Levi. And I never knew this before. It never connected that he is, but that makes a sense because it becomes important later on in the story because of his son and the role that he takes. And so that becomes important later in the story. But what's important for today is that this man had 2 wives. He had 2 wives, and it gives them their name, Peninnah and Hannah. We see polygamy in the Old Testament a lot. Okay, we'll see it with David, who we're introduced to in this book of 1 Samuel later this spring. But the Bible never commends polygamy. It just reports that that's the way it was. And you have to realize that as you read through this, just because this man comes through in a lot of ways as a saint, it doesn't mean everything he does is right. And so the Bible does not teach that. In fact, if you go back to the very beginning in Genesis chapter 2, we looked at that passage where God designed marriage and introduces it last September when we had our anniversaries that we celebrated together. And it's very clear there that God's design is one woman and one man together for life. And polygamy is really a perversion of that. And so just because it's there, don't think that the Bible commends it. In fact, this story indicates some of the problems that kind of arrangement has. Because in this story, these 2 wives are called rivals. That's an interesting word, isn't it? They're called rivals, and you see why here in just a minute. So here's this certain man that's introduced. He had 2 wives, and it says one of his wives was barren. She couldn't have children. And it becomes a key factor in this whole story. Again, this is something, as I mentioned in the intro, that culture looked at as something shameful. The one tradition that says a woman without children is as good as dead. And again, that's very harsh, but that's how they viewed it. In fact, infertility was legitimate grounds for divorce for men. He could divorce his wife simply because he thought she couldn't have children. And so the infertile woman was kind of on the bottom of society. Not only that, but children were important in that culture because it was a culture whose primary economics was subsistence farming, little family farms. And so children were farm workers, especially the boys. And so they were valued for that reason. Not only that, but children were a retirement plan because they didn't have 401ks, they didn't have Social Security, none of this sort of thing was heard of, and the children took care of the older parents as they couldn't do the farm or whatever work they did, and that was how they took care of things. And so children were kind of an insurance policy in a lot of different ways. And in fact, because of that and because of the way the culture viewed infertility, a woman was pretty much taught that her entire significance was tied up in children and childbearing. And that's the kind of culture that we're looking at here when we meet this woman who couldn't have kids. She was taught that her entire worth is tied up in that. And because she couldn't have kids, the other wife who could provoked her. She just kind of rubbed that in her face. And she took special family occasions to make it even worse. And we'll see that in just a minute. And Elkanah's response to her wasn't a whole lot helpful. When he sees how down she is, he says, "Why are you crying?" Well, he should have known. "Why are you so upset?" He really did know. And then he says, "Aren't I worth more to you than sons?" And one of the commentators said, that's a very typical self-centered male response. I had to laugh at that. He wasn't a whole lot of help in this situation. And I point that out, but that aside, he really was a good character. On the positive side, he was a worshiper of the one true God. He was a worshiper of Yahweh. And because of that, every year he went to a place called Shiloh for a feast to worship the Lord there. Now, this was before the temple was built. It's when they still had in Israel the old tabernacle. And it was housed, the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle were housed in this town called Shiloh until about the year 1050. And this is just right before that. This is probably right around 1100 BC sometime. And so they went to the place where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. Possibly the tabernacle was there, or at least some building, if not a tabernacle, they called the temple. And they went there and they worshiped together. We're told that they went there to worship, that a guy named Eli and his two sons were priests there at Shiloh. And this becomes important. We'll look at it particularly next week. But just for now, I want you to know that it's enough to know that Eli's two sons are not the good guys. Okay, they are wicked men, and that comes into play in next week's message in particular, but you need to know that today with what happens in this story. And so he goes there on this annual basis to worship, and that's the very occasion that the other wife took to rub this infertility into the face of Hannah. And it does go on to say, though, that in spite of that, her husband loved her deeply. He didn't see her as good as dead. He didn't see her as worthless for this reason. He continued to love her and even gave her special gifts because of her situation. So that's the first man, Elkanah, the first character. The second character is his wife, Hannah, a barren woman named Hannah. On one particular occasion when the other wife was really rubbing in the fact that Hannah couldn't have children, it was during the feast where they went to the temple to worship, and she got up from the feast. She left the table. She went into what's called the temple. We don't know what that is. It could be the tabernacle. It could be something else. But she went into the worship place, and she just poured out her heart before God. There in that place. She was just pouring out her heart. Her prayer is a prayer with just incredible deep emotion. I'm going to read to you 1 Samuel 1, 9-11. Listen to the description. It said, after they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord, and she was deeply distressed. And she prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. And she vowed a vow to the Lord and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. So she goes in to pray. She calls God by his personal covenant name, Yahweh, and she also calls him the Lord of hosts. That's an interesting title because it appears a lot of places in the Bible, but this is the first time it appears. It says in verse 3 that Elkanah went to worship the Lord of hosts, and that's who she calls on, the Lord of hosts. I think that's interesting because it means that God is over all of the armies of heaven, but it's a title that implies that God has infinite resources And it's appropriate that in this situation she would call on a God of infinite resources because she felt like she needed those resources. It says Eli was there, not his sons, but Eli. And that was a God thing for sure because his sons would have made a mess of this situation. And fortunately, it wasn't them who were there. It was Eli who was there. And in her prayer, Hannah makes a promise to God, a very simple promise. If you will do this, then I will do this. If you will give me a son, then I will give him back to you for all of his life to serve you. A very simple promise. It's not necessarily the recommended way to pray. You know, how often do we make promises to God that are empty? But we learn later in the story she was sincere with this. In fact, it was a prayer that was so emotionally deep and heartfelt that she was pouring out her heart with no words. Have you ever been in that situation where the anguish is such that, you know, your mind is speaking but your words don't come out? That's the situation she was in. And because of that, Eli saw her and he assumed she was drunk. Now, before you're too harsh, before you're too harsh on Eli, stop a minute and let me tell you that it may be, rather than a picture of Eli's character, it may be more a picture of the situation in Israel at the time. Because what it says in the book of Judges near the end of that book a number of times is everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It was a time of great wickedness. And maybe it was very common to see people come into the temple and pray when they were drunk. And it may tell you more the situation they were in than it does in Eli's character and his assumption in that. But as soon as he was corrected, he backed up, he backed away from that, and he gave her a blessing. He said, first of all, shalom, peace. God's peace be with you. And then he added to that blessing, may God grant you your petition. She deeply needed that peace. He didn't know what her petition was. She tells him later. He didn't know, but he gave her that blessing. May God grant you that petition. And so at that point, she gets up and she goes back to her family at the feast. And she ate, where before she wasn't eating. And then the next morning they get up after the feast and it's time to take their pilgrimage back home again. But before they do that, they go into the temple and once again they worship. They worship. It's interesting that back in the early part in verse 3, it said he would go there and worship. But now it says they rose and worshiped. I think that's instructive because there is something that happened in her heart. She got up from that prayer, and it says there in verse 18, she went her way and she ate. She went back to the feast and ate. And she was no longer sad. And she got up the next morning and she worshiped. Something happened to her during that prayer. There was a change in her life and her perspective. During that prayer, God had touched her, and so she worshiped him. And I think it shows us also that this family's practice was to worship. It's what they did. They worshiped the one true God, and they made it a practice. They made it a lifestyle to do that together. And so I think that's instructive to us. So there's this certain man, there's this barren woman, and then there's a baby boy whose name is Samuel. And he will, as you might guess from the name of the book, and if you've read this, that he will dominate our story for a number of weeks from this point on. And so this is the boy that we're talking about. It says that the Lord remembered Hannah. Isn't that an interesting expression, God remembered? When you read that in the Bible, it doesn't mean that God forgot, because God knows everything. But it means that he acted on his plan, on his purpose, on his promises. That's what it means. God remembered Noah, it says, after he'd been in the boat for a long time. God hadn't forgotten that Noah was out there. He was the only thing going on in the world, but hadn't forgotten that, but God acted on that. And it means he acts on her behalf. And that's what he did. He began to carry out his plan, and so she conceived and had a son. After all these years of disappointment, she got pregnant. And having been in that situation, it's a surprise, believe me. And that happened to her. And a son was born to her that she named Samuel. She says, because God has heard my prayer. And if you have a footnote, it may say something like, Samuel means the Lord has heard. There's a debate about what Samuel means, but it's somehow related to that phrase. And so she calls him, God has heard my prayer. That's his name. She didn't go to Shiloh the next year with her husband. She decided, the text says, to wait until he was weaned. Now, don't put that in today's context. Remember, there wasn't baby food. There wasn't plastic baby bottles. They didn't have these kind of things. And children were weaned at a much older age then than they are now, sometimes as much as 3 years old. So we don't know how many years she didn't go to Shiloh, but it was at least one and possibly a couple more before she did. And when she did go, she had a plan. She already had a plan in place when she took the child who was weaned and went to the temple. Samuel was given to God at that point in time. She brought him to Eli. She reminded Eli the priest of who she was, and he remembered the situation. And she said, this is what I prayed for, this son, and God has given him to me. And so she fulfilled the promise that she'd made on that occasion. Verse 26 says, she said, "O my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who was standing here in your presence praying to the Lord. And for this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord." Now there's a word play in this passage that you'll never pick up in English, and I didn't know it until I read it in some of the language scholars that know a whole lot more than I do, because I don't know much about Hebrew. But there's a word play here that is interesting, because the word for petition, which she uses in verse 27, the same word Eli used back in verse 17, may God grant your petition, that word is the same root word as the word translated lent here. And I think that's a horrible translation as I read all of the commentaries and language people, because lent in our language means she let the Lord use him for a while to get him back. But that wasn't the intent here at all. In fact, she very clearly said, I want to give him to the Lord for all of his life. In fact, the scripture says the children belong to God. They're on loan to us, not the other way around. That's why, for instance, the NIV says he was given to the Lord. The New American Standard Bible says he was dedicated to the Lord. Those are better ideas. But what I want to point out is the wordplay that's in there. Same root word. I asked God for this. I petitioned God for this. Now I'm giving this child back to God. And I think that's kind of an interesting connection that's there. And so it says he, notice it's singular, notice it's male. He worshiped the Lord. Samuel was a very young child at this point. But I think that tells us the lifestyle that Elkanah had with his family, that he was a worshiper. And even this young Samuel picked up on that. And knowing he was leaving his parents and being given to the Lord, he worshiped. And I think that's a beautiful picture of what that family did. And then we hear of Hannah's praise, and that's a big chunk of chapter 2, a beautiful prayer that she prays. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in it. It's a great prayer. You want to go back and read it. If you are familiar with what's called the Magnificat, the prayer of Mary, when she found out that she was going to bear the Savior in Luke chapter 1, a lot of people say that prayer is based on this one. And it's interesting that it's kind of in some ways similar situations, an unexpected child God's being praised for. And so you might want to go back and read it. I will point out a few things to it as we look at some applications, because I think it helps us understand the applications here, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time in it. And so Hannah's praise is in chapter 2. So there's the story about a man, his wife who couldn't have children, and God bringing a child into their lives. What are some things we can learn from this story? What are some thoughts that it brings out that help us understand and grow and know God better? Well, the first thing I want to point out is what we've been singing about all day. He is a sovereign ruler. God is a sovereign ruler. We began the service with these words: there is none holy like the Lord. There is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. The Lord is a God of knowledge. By him actions are weighed. And she ends the prayer by saying, the Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. She expresses a great confidence in God that he is in control. Consider how many things happen in this story that really only God could have controlled. A couple of things I want to point out. One, the very first words were, there was a certain man. Now, the reason I point this out is you have to realize that the book of Ruth is a parenthesis, the book that's right before that in our order of Bible things. In the Hebrew Bible, Ruth wasn't there. It's been put there because that's where it fits chronologically. But that's not where it fit in the Hebrew Bible. This book followed right after the book of Judges, and Ruth was put in another place that's called the Writings. But it's been moved. And so you go to the book of Judges, which would have been the words immediately before this, and the last thing it says is, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It's a theme that runs through the last few chapters of that book of Judges that shows how wicked things were getting in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And the very next words are, but there was a certain man. This guy's different. Somehow God was at work in this man's life, and God had this man in the place that he wanted him at the time he wanted him to do the work that he wanted to do. And I think that's instructive to us. Another thing I pointed out that only God can control is the day that Hannah got so upset she left the feast and went into the temple to pray. Eli was the one there and not his sons. And again, they would have made a mess out of this. So it was just a God thing that he was the one there. It wasn't an accident. And then, of course, she conceived and had a child, something completely in God's hands. And yet God did that. You think about that phrase in the end of the book of Judges, everyone did what was right in his own eyes, and it probably seemed to a few good people in the world that the world was going to hell in a handbasket, to use a modern expression. And yet God was still in control. God was still carrying out his plan. I wrote it this way. I said, in the midst of complete corruption, God was bringing about his desired end through his faithful servants. In spite of the fact the world seemed completely corrupt, God was still at work. He's always there. He's always working behind the scenes, working in the background to carry out his perfect plan, even when we don't see it. And that's what was happening in this story. You can trust that kind of God because he is in control, even when we don't see it. And I think that's so appropriate today because how much of our world is just that same corruption? Everyone does what's right in his own eyes. And everyone fights for rights to do whatever evil they want to do. And yet we need to realize that God is still in control, that he's still a God who rules. And he does work behind the scenes to bring about his desired end. God is a sovereign ruler. Number 2, God uses the lowly and the despised. Listen to her prayer in verses 8 and 9. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness. For it's not by might that a man shall prevail. You see, she recognizes that God is in control, and she recognizes that he uses the lowly and despised. In a very male-dominated world, God was using a woman. God was using a woman who couldn't have children, who in that society was about as low as it can get. And yet God had a special place for her. He uses the lowly and the despised. As I mentioned earlier, he often blessed women considered barren. Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel And Samson's mom, we don't know her name, it's not given. All of those happened before this story. Hannah probably knew their stories, and also Elizabeth in the New Testament. God often uses women in that situation for his purposes, and he was doing the same thing here, and he used her in that. The first hero of our book is someone considered downtrodden by the culture and by the other wife in the family. And yet that she becomes the hero, one of the heroes of the story. I think that teaches us a couple things. It teaches us that life is precious, that human life is precious, that every life is precious. And maybe that's a good thing to share today, because today is recognized in some places in the U.S. as Sanctity of Human Life Sunday, when we should be celebrating the value of all human life. And this story teaches us that that's exactly the case. We are all, as humans, made in the image of God, and that puts a certain value on us, regardless of where we fall on the social ladder. But another thing it teaches us is that God uses all kinds of people. And I preached through the book of Judges a few years ago, and if you were here for that series, it had a profound impact on me because of the kinds of people that God used in that book. Some pretty strange characters that God used in leadership and brought about his will through them. And so I think that's instructive to us as well. Kathy and I were in the car yesterday, and I think we had Way FM on, and these words came over the radio when we started the car, and I had to go, what song is this? And I had to look it up. It's a Matthew West called Me on Your Mind. Who am I that the King of the world would give one single thought about my broken heart? And who am I that the God of all grace wipes the tears from my face and says, come as you are? You paid the price. You took the cross. You gave your life. And you did it all with me on your mind. Who am I that the King of the world would even give a thought to my broken heart? And yet that's what our sovereign God does. He cares for the downtrodden. He cares for the lowly, the despised, and the broken. And he uses them in his kingdom work. Related to that, number 3, God is a God of reversals. God is a God of reversals. Listen to Hannah's prayer in verses 4 through 7. He said, the bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who are full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. The Lord brings down to Sheol, and he raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust, and so on. Beautiful words that show that God is the God of reversals. He remembered Hannah even in her low and broken estate. And in the same way, he can lift you up from whatever situation you're in that feels broken, that feels forgotten, that feels lowly. But don't read too much into this, because it's the God of reversals doesn't necessarily reverse things in our situation so much as he does in our heart. I want you to see something very interesting in here. Hannah felt fulfilled before she conceived a son, because she went in to pray, and when she left, it says she went back to the feast and she ate with the family. She ceased being sad, and she got up the next morning and worshiped. And that's why I wanted to point that out, because it shows us there was something more than having a son that filled her life. What filled her life was God himself. That's what filled her life. And that's the perspective we need to have. Whatever brokenness we think we have, whatever we think may be lacking in our lives, it's not that thing that will fulfill us. It's God himself who will fulfill us, whether that thing comes or not. And that's what happened to Hannah. That's why sometimes in the Psalms, God is called our portion. Psalm 73, there's nothing I desire besides you. My heart and my flesh may fail, but God is the strength of my life and my portion forever. It's God who fills us, And she seems to recognize that because she was filled after pouring out her heart to God and turning her life to him. So God is a sovereign ruler. He uses the lowly and despised. He's the God of reversals. And the last one is this: God has a plan for your children. God has a plan for your children. And some of us are older. Put grandchildren in there if that fits a little better. God has a plan for your children or grandchildren. You know, Hannah's faithfulness is inspiring. It's been inspiring to a lot of people. She remained resolute through this whole time. Chapter 1, verse 11, she said, I will give this child to the Lord. In verse 22, when her husband said, let's go to the feast, she said, no. She said, I'm going to wean him first so I can give him to the Lord. And then in verse 28, when she did go through with that promise. I mean, she remained resolute through the whole time. Her first promise was not a rash response to her distress. It was a sincere promise to God that she carried out. And how hard that must have been. Can you imagine, mothers? You know, we had, as I said, we had waited a long time for children. When Amber was born, she was a preemie. We lived in Alamosa, Colorado at 7,600 feet elevation, and there was no incubators or anything like that in the hospital there. And when Amber was born that early, her lungs hadn't developed. And they put her on a Learjet and flew her to Presbyterian St. Luke's Hospital here in Denver. She was born in the middle of the night, and the very next morning, they took her away and flew her up here to Denver. And that was so hard on Kathy because we'd waited so long for this child, and then it was just kind of ripped out of our arms. It's a really hard thing. And it says nothing about that with Hannah. It simply says she was resolute to carry out her promise, but it just had to be a struggle for her in that situation. I'm sure it was. But she was resolved to be faithful. The Bible tells us that children are a gift from the Lord. I mentioned this earlier. You can look it up in Psalm 127:3 for an example. Children are his. They are a gift to us, not the other way around. And so we have to keep that perspective. And with that perspective in mind, and seeing Hannah's incredible example, I have two questions. I don't want to step on toes, but I think they're questions that we need to ponder. And that's number one: do we allow our children to be what God wants them to be? Do we allow our children to be what God wants them to be? Or do we live out our own desires through them? We have to ask that. It's a tough question to ask, but I think we have to evaluate that because I've seen too many parents trying to live out their dreams through their children, and that's not God's plan for their children at all. Second question, are we raising our children as citizens of earth or as citizens of God's kingdom? How often is our training of our children, and particularly as they get older, more focused on good jobs than on good character? How often is our raising our children focused more on making a living than on serving God? You know, the promise of God is seek first his kingdom and all those other things will be given to you. And yet sometimes I think the way we raise our children, we turn it around. Are we raising them to be citizens of God's kingdom? Hard questions, but I think maybe they need to be asked. A lot of you know my mother-in-law, Marie Vanderford. She passed away 3 years ago this month. And I remember when Kathy's older sister, Lynn, was commissioned to go to the mission field. She and her husband went to Peru as missionaries. And I remember after the commissioning service, some lady in their church asking her, and she said she got this question before, aren't you afraid of sending them to a third world country? Her amazing response was, that's what I raised her for. That's what I raised her for. You know, at one of her memorial services, we kind of took a survey of her descendants that were there. And I don't remember the exact numbers. We just asked, how many people here are either in full-time ministry or preparing for full-time ministry? And of her children and grandchildren, it was more than 50% of them. that we're doing that. What a beautiful example. What a beautiful example. We see that in Hannah, and I think it's one we need to copy. Trusting in a sovereign God and turning our children over to him.